Hey there, welcome to the Lore to Death podcast, a deep dive into the lore of your favorite games, movies, shows, and more. My name is Brett, and today I'm diving back into the world of Baldur's Gate 3 and Dungeons & Dragons by popular demand to talk about the bane of the Mind Flayer's existence. I talked about them in my previous episode about the Mind Flayers, but I didn't go into too much detail other than what was needed to understand their significance to the Illithid Empire. But apparently that wasn't enough for you thirsty folks, and I've had plenty of people ask for a complete history of the Gith, and I am here to serve. As usual, I want to give the forewarning that there might be some slight spoilers for Baldur's Gate 3, but nothing major in this episode. I promise we're barely even going to touch on Baldur's Gate 3, but I figure I want to give the forewarning just in case. The Gith are a very important part of the game, but nothing I mention is going to spoil the main game any more than the episode about the Illithid Empire did. I'll just be referencing characters within the games and using any new information that we got about the Gith. But again, no major spoilers. So without further ado, let's meet our favorite frog people. The Gith are a humanoid race. They are slender, tall figures ranging anywhere from 5 to 7 feet tall, weighing anywhere from 90 to 200 pounds. Being a very slender people, their features tended to be very sharp and angular. They typically have some sort of darker markings on their skin, much like frogs and toads have some fun little accent colors. Also, like frogs, they tend to have sunken, beady black eyes. Their most notable features, I think you'll find, are their tiny, flattened noses and their pointed, serrated ears and sharp teeth. And unlike frogs, they were able to grow hair, which came in either black or red, and they typically styled it in a top-knot fashion. The name Gith is kind of confusing, however, so let me explain that thought before I go any further. Gith is, by all intents and purposes, the name of the race of Gith. Gith is also the language that they speak, and the name of the leader who freed the Gith from their Illithid enslavement. That last part is what makes this slightly confusing to me. So whether or not Gith was named after the race of Gith, or the Gith, as a race, were named after her is currently unknown, at least to me. I just find it interesting that the race, their language, and one of the most prominent person in their history are all named Gith. They're all the same thing. It's just another one of those weird things, like, what came first, the chicken or the egg, the frog or the tadpole, the Gith or the Gith? And this is such a minute detail that I really shouldn't care about, and I'm sure that no one else cares about this, but I do care, and you can't stop me fretting over the smallest detail. I just wanted to voice that thought because I don't know what came first, Gith, Gith, or Gith, but we'll get back to Gith, the person, in a moment. I mentioned that their language is also called Gith, and I'm really getting the sense that they were not good at naming conventions, and each tribe spoke a slightly different dialect, but it was the same language. It's like Quebecois and French. One might laugh at the other and call it stupid, but they're both fundamentally terrible languages. They also had a written language called Tirsu, and I just want to, again, put another forewarning. A lot of the way that Gith things are named is kind of extremely hard to pronounce, for myself at least. It seems like all the syllables are separated by an apostrophe, and that just confuses my brain. I have no idea if I'm saying any of these things correctly, so anytime that I mention the name of something in this language, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing it correctly. There are a few things from Baldur's Gate 3 that I can use as reference so I can pronounce correctly, but things like this, no idea. So their written language was called Tirsu, which is going to sound very familiar if you've ever watched Doctor Who. The way that they wrote was by arranging characters in a circle. Each tribe did it a little differently, though. The Githyanki started from the top and went clockwise, whereas the Githzerai started from the bottom and the characters went counterclockwise. But it was the same premise. Each character in the language represented either a single character or an entire word, and each circle that those characters went around formed what was either an entire thought or sentence. So there are a bunch of individual characters that make up a larger character, But that larger character in our language would be a single word, whereas in their language, it was an entire thought or sentence. The way that these are arranged kind of look like the spoke of a wheel, and I think that's the best way that I can describe it. Each character consists of a straight line with different shapes along it, and when they're put into a full shape, it looks like a circle with several spokes coming out of it. As I'm writing this, and as I'm saying this, I feel like I'm not describing it very well, and I'm struggling to find the words to make it make sense to someone who is just listening and has never seen it before. So I would recommend looking it up. It's actually pretty neat. And it does really remind me of Gallifreyan, but a slightly more primitive, angular version of it. Normally, I would go right into the physical traits and magical abilities that the race has, but once again, things are a little complicated with the Gith. I mentioned the two tribes, Githyanki and Githzerai, briefly there, and you would think that since they came from the same race that they would have the same abilities, but it's not necessarily that cut and dry. There's also the Pirates of the Gith and the Githvyrik tribes, who are quite different as well, but it's hard to talk about each of those individually without understanding the greater picture as to why they're all separated. So I wanted to shuffle it up a little bit and go right into the history of the Gith, because that will more or less explain everything. Then I can go into each tribe or subrace if it's easier to understand it that way, and I think that makes it a little bit easier to understand. So let's just get right into their origins and history. I know that I mentioned this in my episode about mind flayers as well, but it's not exactly known where the Gith come from. And by that, I don't mean what ship they flew in on. I mean that we don't know what their original race was. And if you haven't listened to the Mind Flayer episode, that statement might be a little confusing. So let's just start there. The Gith were a race that was created by the Mind Flayers, or at least that's what the popular theory suggests. As far as we can tell, because they don't really have much history before they were enslaved by the Mind Flayers, they were enslaved and genetically modified by the Mind Flayers to basically be the perfect thralls. There are some theories about what the Gith were before they were Gith, but nothing is concrete. Some say that they were once humans, brought to the astral plane from the world of Pharagos, and were genetically modified over time to be what they are today. Others say that they are a mix of several different races, shaped by the power of the Far Realm, which is basically a realm of horrors that twisted and shaped beings who entered it into grotesque forms. And this is one of the places that Mind Flayers are said to have evolved from, or at least gotten some of their power from. The Gith even have a myth of some forerunners, which they claim were the Gith before they were enslaved, and they were supposedly a pure version of the Gith, but any information about this has been lost to time. From the book Lords of Madness, the Book of Aberrations, we get a passage that tells us that they were quite literally created by the Mind Flayers by genetically mixing different thralls, and that their original form was unknown. I'm going to take this as the canon answer because, like everything that is shrouded in mystery, it's hard to tell fact from fiction, and most theories were probably created by a drunk guard in a tavern who heard these things from a friend of a friend. Regardless of where they came from, they spent an unknown period of time being enslaved by the Illithid Empire. There isn't a lot of information about that period of time and what exactly the Gith did as their slaves, but this is where we start to get some information about Gith, the person, not the race. But even Gith's past is a bit unclear. Some say that she was just a foot soldier in the Illithid army, but others say that she was the personal bodyguard to a powerful Mind Flayer. While we don't know exactly which of those might be true, what we do know is that Gith possessed a mutation that prevented Elder Brains from maintaining the Illithid hive mind. I went over the effects of the Elder Brain in the Mind Flayer episode more in detail, and I promise I'll stop referencing that episode soon, but I'll give the footnotes here. Basically, every Mind Flayer within a certain vicinity to an Elder Brain was under the complete control of said Elder Brain. The brain created a hive mind where it funneled its thoughts and desires to every Mind Flayer that it could reach, and made sure that they were doing its bidding for the grand design. So you can imagine that a slave possessing the ability to disrupt that field of control would pose a very significant threat. However, I have some questions that I can't find the answers to. Chief among them is, how did the Mind Flayers allow her to exist when she disrupted the Elder Brain's field of control? Surely, someone must have noticed that everywhere this slave went, no one was connected to the Wi-Fi. That is, unless Gith had the ability to toggle her field of effect on and off, or was able to select who and what it affected. But I tried searching for an answer and I couldn't find anything specific. We get some information from Baldur's Gate 3 with Orpheus, but that's kind of getting ahead of ourselves. But that evidence suggests that they are able to kind of select who and what they protect, but I don't really know to what extent that's true. It's one of those things that's left in the background and you kind of have to imagine the story behind, but I have to imagine that's the case, and maybe she can choose who she protects from the Elder Brain's control and who she doesn't, because that would mean that she could fly under the radar while surrounded by mind flayers. Either way, slave rebellions against the Illithids were not uncommon, but because mind flayers are exceptionally strong beings, they were usually able to crush any rebellion before it had a chance to be any sort of threat. However, Gith was the first one to unite a force strong enough to create such a threat. She managed to band together different rebel groups in a way that no one else had before. And this is why I think it makes sense that she was a high-ranking slave to a powerful mind flayer, because if she were just some unremarkable foot soldier, I don't think that she would have had that much influence over the other groups of Gith. So with a large group of rebels, she was able to lead them to a victory over the Illithids, and they were able to break free from their enslavement. I'm sure that Gith's ability to disrupt the Elder Brain's field of control was a great contributor to this, seeing as it's her only real defining trait as a Gith, but I can't seem to find any mention of exactly how it was used to help them break free. I just have to speculate that it did, indeed, help them in some way, shape, or form. I'm pretty sure that being broken off from the Elder Brain's control without one's consent would have been a pretty disorienting experience, almost like waking up from a dream suddenly. So I would imagine that Gith was able to use that vulnerable state against the mind flayers to help take the colony down. This rebellion was the largest and most catastrophic known event to the mind flayers up to this point, and since then they have never quite recovered from its effects. It was this rebellion alone that allowed Gith to free her people, and so Gith was almost deified by the act. After the rebellion, Gith insisted that they keep up the momentum and begin to hunt down every mind flayer in existence across the multiverse, so as to end any threat of an Illithid empire ever cropping up again. She believed that it was only then, when they were defeated, that people were going to be able to truly explore what the multiverse had to offer. And while this was a very righteous goal and every Gith shared a hatred for the mind flayers, not all of them agreed that this was what was in the best interest for their race. There were others who felt that the best course of action was to take advantage of their newfound freedom and look inwards to start repairing the damage that was done to their people during their enslavement. The one who led this group of Gith was named Zerthimon, and it wasn't just a simple disagreement and an amicable split. Rather, this ideology started a civil war between Zerthimon and Gith because Zerthimon was actively undermining the Gith war effort. After a long period of civil war, Zerthimon was eventually killed, and the group that followed him was united under their new leader, Zereth Menyar Ag Gith, who I'm just going to refer to as Menyar Ag for simplicity's sake. And this group was forced to retreat into Limbo, a chaotic outer plane, in defeat. And so after this point, both factions were considered different entities. And those who followed Menyar Ag and Zerthimon's philosophies were called the Githzerai, and the ones who followed Gith were known as the Githyanki. Because of the nature of their split and the civil war, both groups hated each other and were likely to slaughter one another on sight. Their hatred for each other wasn't quite as bad as their hatred for Illithids, but it went as far as they didn't see each other as the same race, but something entirely separate from themselves. And so at this point, I think that it's worth taking a moment to talk about both of these splintered groups and what makes them both unique from each other. And by take a moment, I mean take most of the episode, because this is the bulk of it. We'll start with the one that we have less information about, and that'll be the Githzerai, or Zerthimon's tribe. Because of their philosophical differences from Gith's vision, where they wanted to look inside themselves and try to find peace within themselves rather than just go into a constant war, they were a bit more of a peaceful people. They were simple, frugal people who preferred practical and unadorned clothing and chose to follow a more monastic approach. The Githzerai became philosophers, pursuing self-knowledge through intense training and meditation. But not every Githzerai was the same. There were those who closely followed the teachings of Zerthimon, who were known as the Zerths. There were also those who simply trained as monks, not necessarily under the teachings of Zerthimon. And these were the most common. They were just Gith who wanted to exist as Gith without going to war all the time. And then there were those who chose to splinter off and lose their natural magic resistance by choosing to become wizards. Now, this next point is the same for all Gith. It's not necessarily Githzerai specific, but they all had a subtle affinity for magic and psionics, which came from their constant exposure to the mind flayers and their mind control. And that's what gave them their natural magic resistance, like I mentioned just now with the wizards. But in order to fully hone this and become a wizard and someone who primarily chose spellcasting as their attacks, you did kind of have to shed that magical resistance and open up that barrier so that you could use more intense magics. However, all Githzerai were capable of casting minor telekinesis spells like Mage Hand, and could train to use spells like Shield or Detect Thoughts at will. The Githzerai would hone in on their innate magical ability and infuse magic into their combat skills. However, Zerths had access to more psionic powers than the other Githzerai. They could innately reproduce effects similar to Featherfall, Phantasmal Killer, Plane Shift, and See ability at their base level, while more experienced or enlightened Githzerai might be able to produce effects similar to Expeditious Retreat, Haste, and Teleport. And yes, I did mention Plane Shift, which is a 7th level conjuration spell. And for someone to cast that without having spent their entire life focusing on magic is pretty impressive. Like I mentioned, this was an enlightened Githzerai ability. This wasn't just limited to those who became wizards. Pretty much all Githzerai and Gith in general knew how to use Plane Shift, and they were able to cast it at will despite not being primarily spellcasters. This is likely a byproduct of their time spent enslaved by the Mind Flayers, since they were constantly bouncing between planes in order to expand the Illithid Empire. But I'm not sure exactly. It seems like they were able to hone in on that effect and cast it using a similar effect, and I think that's the important distinction, is that they're not casting the spell Plane Shift, they are using their psionic ability to reproduce an effect similar to Plane Shift, which I think is pretty interesting. All I know is that Plane Shift is a pretty big spell to have, and is a huge part of the reason why the Gith are so dangerous to the Mind Flayers. Anyways, back to the Githzerai, I mentioned the entire reason that they splintered off from the Githyanki was because of their philosophical differences sparked from Zerthimon. Because of this, they valued their own personal freedom and didn't want to behold themselves to being instruments of destruction that would repeat the same cycle of violence that had been imposed on their race for centuries. But this doesn't mean that they were entirely peaceful people and they didn't gather Illithid hunting parties. It just means that they didn't base their entire existence on how many Mind Flayers they were able to kill. If they caught wind of Mind Flayer activity, you can best bet that they would gather a hunting party to make sure that it would not grow to be a threat. I also mentioned before that they were forced to retreat to Limbo, which is a chaotic outer plane. The Githzerai were able to harness the power of the chaos within this plane and use it to channel the power of spawning stones to control the very plane itself. Using this power, they were able to physically shape their surroundings and created great monasteries out of adamantine and stone. Particularly strong Githzerai were known as anarchs, and they were not only able to shape the landscape of Limbo, but they were able to harness the power of Limbo to create fortresses and buildings outside of the plane. But it wasn't just monasteries and fortresses that they had entire cities in Limbo, and this would be where the less devout Githzerai live. These folks were not as strict in following their martial disciplines as those who resided in the monasteries, but they still respected and understood their culture. The largest Githzerai city in Limbo was called Sha'sal, which served as a capital of sorts, and this is where Manar Og resided. Manar Og ended up basically being deified, and survived for centuries as the Githzerai's god king. However, for most of this time, he wasn't exactly in a proper living state. Manar Og had such a mastery over the mind that he was able to put himself in a kind of stasis, where he was neither living nor dead, but somewhere in Limbo. And during his reign as God King, he was even potentially considered a proper demigod, which is pretty impressive, and that speaks to the power that he had. But while he was their God King, he seemingly wasn't the only one who was worshipped by the Githzerai. Inside of their largest monastery, Zerthimon, which was large enough to be considered a city in its own, there were temples to several other deities, including Corellon, the patron god of all elves, Moradin, the lawful good god of the dwarves, and the Raven Queen, the Shadowfell goddess of fate, death, and winter. Now, I say that they seemingly worshipped these gods because I don't know for a fact that they didn't. I don't see why there would have been temples to those deities if not to be worshipped, and there wasn't exactly a plethora of other races inside the Githzerai temples because they really hated anything that wasn't Gith. This is a very common theme among the Gith, is that they really don't like anything that isn't their own. They despise other races and see them as lesser than themselves, which is pretty terrible, but it means that they were really only surrounded by their own people. And that's basically all there is to know about the Githzerai. There's some more general information that's shared between the Githzerai and the Githyanki, but I can kind of touch on that after I go over the Githyanki. So, the Githzerai were monks, and the Githyanki were fighters, to put it in D&D terms. Their entire culture was based around combat, and so the Githyanki were a group of merciless warriors. I find it interesting, though, that in their culture they didn't discriminate against male nor female, and everyone was welcome to become a warrior by right of being born a Githyanki. And similar to the Githzerai, and I did kind of mention this, they had a host of innate magical abilities from which they could draw on. This included Mage Hand, Misty Step, and non-detection spells, while the stronger amongst them were able to cast spells like Plane Shift and Telekinesis. Using spells like this along with their fighting styles made them particularly deadly, same as the Githzerai. The Githyanki society, being very military-driven, was organized and orderly. Just like they didn't discriminate with genders, blood ties also had no effect on how high a Githyanki could rise. They instead ran on a meritocratic system, which meant that the only thing that mattered was what you were able to accomplish, meaning that anyone, regardless of their birth, was able to become the best of the best as long as they trained hard enough. But a result of this system was that the Githyanki tended to be very individualistic and, honestly, selfish. They tended to use others to further their own personal goals and didn't have very many parasocial relationships with other Githyanki. But, of course, you can't have a society that's just full of hunters and warriors. You need the gatherers as well. And so the Githyanki had a caste system in place. Although I think it's important to note that you weren't necessarily bound to your caste. You could work your way into another caste if you wanted to, but would have to undergo a tremendous challenge to be able to prove your worth to be able to do so. The three castes were the Glath, who were in charge of food production and general labor. Although this is a hard job when you live in the astral plane where nothing grows, so they had to get creative. Some were able to channel their psionic abilities to grow a type of fungus that didn't require sunlight to grow, while others harvested some sort of edible substance from the God Isles, which were the corpses of deities that floated throughout the astral plane. And yes, there's no more to the phrase substance. I would imagine that it's some kind of slime that grows on the walls or something, but I have no idea. I don't like that they refer to their food source as a substance, but it is what it is. So basically, these were the farmers of the Githyanki, but the Glath were looked upon as unimportant, seeing as Githyanki didn't require food while they were in the astral plane, and their services were only needed when they traveled outside of it. And I'll touch on that bit about the astral plane in just a minute. The second caste was called the Malar, and they were in charge of specialized tasks and craft making. I like to think that these are groups of Githyanki who are just making hand turkey paintings all day, but realistically they were in charge of things like creating weapons and astral ships, as well as repairing and maintaining them. And then there's the military caste, which itself was split into its own subgroups with knights, warriors, and spellcasters. The military hierarchy was divided into companies of 10 warriors and or spellcasters, and each company was led by a Sarth. Each group of 10 Sarths was led by a Kithrak, and every 10 groups of Kithrak were led by a Supreme Commander. I tried to see if there was a cool name for this Supreme Commander, but it doesn't seem like there is anything. You'd think that they would have a word for this in Gith, but apparently Supreme Commander is good enough. But those Supreme Commanders were led by the leader of the Githyanki. But, Brett, you didn't mention the knights in there. Yes, I know, I was getting to it. Calm down. A knight stood outside of the military hierarchy in a way, and was more of a political figure than anything, and are the only ones who reported directly to the queen. It's not said directly, but it feels like the Supreme Commanders might also be the Knights, but then again, the Supreme Commanders could be the direct report to the Knights, and then the Knights got their orders from the Gith leader. I have no idea. The Knights wielded silver swords, which were the signature weapon of the Githyanki. These silver swords were able to damage the opponent's mind as well as their body, meaning that it does psychic damage as well if wielded by a Gith. And if you thought that was metal, in the astral plane, a knight's silver sword was able to sever the silver cord that was connected to the body of a traveler by using astral projection. Don't ask me how it works, but that was really just a lot of words to say that if their attack was successful, it would kill its target immediately by ripping the soul out of their body. Outside of the three sects that made up the Githyanki, there were some specialized positions that some took up. Kind of like the Githzerai anarchs, there were Githyanki who specialized in manipulating the raw energy of the astral plane for various purposes, known as the Hraknir. These Hraknir would be healers like the Gustil, who were imperative since natural healing spells didn't work in the astral plane, or those like the Varithan, who were responsible for converting energy into material that the Malar could use to build structures or vehicles with. There were also the Seers, or Senjasi, and the Yearn, who could teleport large amounts of material within the astral plane. So all of these groups worked together to make sure that everything was running smoothly. And then, of course, it wouldn't be a good episode if things didn't get really weird for a second. And I'm sure that you didn't expect ghosts to appear in Githyanki culture, but here we are. The undead spirits of knights would just kinda hang around, and they were called Vlaakiths. They are particularly kind of strange, and I don't really understand their purpose. They could not interact with their physical environment except through combat, in which they still had access to their silver swords and martial abilities that they had in life, but they couldn't otherwise speak to or interact with anything or anyone. The Vlaakiths would usually hang around their usual haunts, meaning that if they were a guard in life, they would typically maintain that guard post wherever it was. So if you're planning on raiding a crèche anytime soon, you might want to beware of ghosts. Aside from the Githyanki that you can physically see, you might also get randomly attacked by an invisible spirit who has the ability to kill you in one shot by severing your soul from your body. Man, I can't get over that attack. It just seems so ridiculously overpowered and cool. But this entire point begs the question of, do the Githzerai also have spirit warriors? I would imagine that the monks would have been the first to have them, not the fighters, but I didn't seem to find any evidence that would have suggested that they existed within Githzerai culture. And maybe these specters had something to do with the astral plane, and that's why the Githyanki have them. I'm really not entirely sure. There's no information about it. I wish that there was some information about that. But in that tangent about their military hierarchy, I almost forgot to go over the other sections of Githyanki society, so here we go. I mentioned that they live in the astral plane and that they didn't need to eat while they were there. That's because, in the astral plane, time does not pass like we know it to. It did still flow, but time passed so slowly that it might as well not exist. They say that 1,000 years could pass in the astral plane and feel like only one day passed, so it's considered to be an effectively timeless plane. Because of this, creatures did not tend to age while they lived there, and this ended up affecting the Githyanki culture pretty heavily. Unlike the Githzerai, who dressed very modestly, the Githyanki would dress themselves in ornate clothing and armor and like to adorn themselves with trinkets from their slain foes and triumphs. It was fairly common for their weapons and armor to be overly decorated with gems, feathers, precious metals, and God knows what other ornaments. They all basically dressed like that eccentric old lady that we know who frequents thrift stores and bedazzles everything. But aside from that, they also had plenty of hobbies. Seeing as they didn't age while they were in the astral plane, they needed something to pick up to keep some semblance of novelty in their lives. And so it was pretty common for a Githyanki to have dozens upon dozens of hobbies, but never take the time to properly master any of them. A jack of all trades and master of none, if you will. After centuries, this led to a hollow culture of shallow interests and unfinished undertakings. And their only true point of interest in the world was hunting down Illithids, as was their purpose under Gith. And speaking of Gith, their culture was largely based around hunting down mind flayers to the point where it was considered a rite of passage to raid an Illithid stronghold. Their own strongholds were almost as ornate as their weapons and armor. Githyanki residences tended to be massive and lavishly decorated. Their largest city was called Tu Narath, and was built on the corpse of a being known only as the One in the Void. But while this city was massive, the Githyanki were creatures of solitude, and they preferred to be in their own company to the company of others in smaller communities scattered throughout the astral plane. This lack of family bonds and friendship meant that they typically lived alone, and the closest that a Githyanki would have to a friend was their relationship with their training partners, which was maintained almost strictly for their own personal gain. Could a Githyanki have friends? Sure, it's not impossible. But as a general rule of thumb, they kept to themselves, they didn't like other people, and that included other Githyanki. Again, because of their meritocratic society, they were very competitive, and that led to a lot of spite and differences between people. So we mentioned how Zerthimon was killed in battle, but whatever happened to Gith? Well, sometime after their battle, it said that she went to the Nine Hells with her advisor, Vlaakith, to broker a deal with the Dragon Queen Tiamat. This deal was supposed to give the Githyanki the red dragons that they were known for that they would ride into battle. However, only Vlaakith returned with a red dragon consort, Ephelamon, who went to Gith's followers and declared that Gith had made the ultimate sacrifice for her people, seemingly sacrificing herself as part of a deal that would allow the Githyanki to ride said dragons. Seeing how Gith was suddenly dead and Vlaakith was her second in command, Vlaakith was named the first queen of the Githyanki while they awaited for Gith's prophesied return. However, it turns out that Vlaakith was a lying snake. She knowingly sent Gith to die so that Gith's son, Orpheus, could not succeed her in the event of her death. She knew that Orpheus would indeed succeed her, as he had the same defect that Gith had, which gave her the ability to disrupt the Elder Brain's field of control. After Vlaakith took the throne, Orpheus led Gith's honor guard in a revolt to name himself the rightful king of the Githyanki in what would be known as the War of the Comet. Despite putting up a good fight, Orpheus was defeated in the end. But he was not killed like most Githyanki thought he was. Rather, he was imprisoned in the astral plane in a crystalline cage that could only be broken by the Orphic hammer, which, somehow, I don't know how, ended up in the possession of the devil Raphael, son of Mephistopheles. And so, Vlaakith started her reign as Vlaakith I, and would be the first of at least 157 rulers who held the same title of Vlaakith. Vlaakith saw herself as a divine being, and entered lichdom to become undead and serve over the Githyanki for eternity. She offered a proclamation that those who proved themselves worthy would be able to achieve ascension and be welcomed into her court. This was, of course, the goal for pretty well every Githyanki. In a meritocratic society, the highest honor that you could get was to be personally invited to the queen's court. However, it was a deep, dark secret that ascension would basically mean becoming a husk that the queen would draw her lich powers from. So, it was a hollow promise, and while every Githyanki wanted it, it's something that no one should ever want. And it was about as hollow as a promise as you could expect from Vlaakith. And that kind of segues into the next line pretty well, which is religion. We saw that in the Githzerai monasteries they had temples to various deities, but they also kind of worshipped Zerthimon and Maenarag. The Githyanki, on the other hand, did not have multiple deities. In fact, they had no religion in their society at all. Their society was too militaristic and organized to have a place for religion, as typically religion requires you to do something for other people, and the Githyanki were not about that life. They did encounter deities all the time in the astral plane, but they were all dead, and the Githyanki built their cities on top of their corpses, so that probably made it hard for them to take any sort of divinity seriously. So the closest thing that they had to a god was Vlaakith. But they didn't worship her as a deity, but rather respected her as their superior in a typical military fashion. Of course, no people are the same, and that does go for the Githyanki as well. That means that there were fringe groups amongst the Githyanki who attempted to worship other gods. Because of this, that meant that there were clerics in their ranks, however they were exceedingly rare. This was because any attempt to worship anything other than herself was crushed by Vlaakith, as she was a very vain ruler and wanted all eyes on her. So, any clerics that existed had to do so in secret as not to be killed on the spot. And to close this chapter on the Githyanki, I just wanted to talk more about their red dragons for a moment. I mentioned them briefly before, and that the knights rode them into battle, but there's a bit more to it that I didn't want to go too far into and disrupt that portion of the story. So we know that Gith was sacrificed to Tiamat in some fashion to bring about this accord with Vlaakith and the Red Dragons. But what was the dragons' part in this? Obviously, the Githyanki benefited from this deal by being able to bring dragons into a fight, which gave them a considerable boost in power. But what did the dragons get out of this pact? Well, the dragons that they rode were actually younger dragons, not adults. These dragons served dutifully and without complaint, which kept them in the good graces of the Githyanki and kept them out of their politics. Because, remember, dragons aren't just beasts that the Githyanki managed to tame. Dragons are exceptionally intelligent creatures who are able to think for themselves, each of them having their own personality just like any person would. As younglings, the red dragons would serve a Githyanki knight. That doesn't mean that they would always be by the side of said knight, however, it just means that they would come when summoned. When a red dragon reached adulthood, their accord was over and they would be dismissed from their service and replaced by another younger dragon. According to a chart that I found, dragons are typically in their young age from 6 years old and would reach adulthood around 100 years old. The exact details of what age they would begin their service to a knight is unknown, but it seems like they could start as early as 6, which means that they would be with their knight for well over 100 years, depending on what the initial age is. I mentioned that red dragons served without complaint, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily enjoyed being in servitude. I'm not sure that anyone does enjoy being in servitude. The dragons typically wanted to get out of their contract as soon as they could, so that they could be their own person, or dragon. But the Githyanki living in the astral plane made this slightly tricky, since aging didn't really happen there because the flow of time was so slow. That's what I meant by they could serve over 100 years, because while technically their term might be somewhere around 94 years, time doesn't exist in the astral plane, and the more time they spend in the astral plane is more time that they have to spend in servitude, where they aren't aging. And this is where we come back around to the point of dragons not necessarily being next to their respective knight at all times. Because if that were the case, each dragon could easily spend thousands of years in servitude rather than the 100 or so that they would spend if they were to spend their time entirely in the prime material plane. It's for this reason that the red dragons preferred to spend most of their time in the prime material plane so that they could actually age and get out of their contract within a reasonable time frame. They would do their best to participate in raids as often as possible to make sure that they were in the prime as much as they could be, and they would spend plenty of time watching over Githyanki Crèches as well. I think this is like the second or third time that I've mentioned crèches, and I'll get back to that in a minute, I promise. Okay, so I know initially that question was, what benefit was there to the red dragons? And so far, it seems like they got nothing out of the experience. But in every raid that they participated in, the red dragon would get their share of treasure. And if you know anything about dragons, it's that they like their shiny piles of gold. So when the dragon finally reached adulthood, they would get to keep all of the plunder that they got from the various raids and experiences, which was pretty valuable to them. They got to spend over 100 years in servitude and kept everything that they accumulated, and that was enough for them to be okay with making the deal. They got to grow in power as they gained experience from the constant raids, and they got to keep all of their wealth. It's a win-win for them as far as they're concerned. One last thing on the red dragons is that there was a time when Vlaakith tried to make a Githyanki dragon hybrid by infusing red dragon blood into a newborn Githyanki. This resulted in the creation of a new hybrid race known as the Duthka Gith, which were despised amongst other Githyanki. Honestly, you could think of them like dragonborn Githyanki, which meant that they were stronger, faster, and more intelligent than the average Githyanki, meaning that in this meritocratic society, they were able to climb the ranks with relative ease. This is why Githyanki tended to look down upon them. However, they did have their place in Githyanki society, serving as elite shock guards and palace guards because of their innate battle prowess. And that brings us to a nice endpoint about the Githyanki without going into the entire history of Vlaakith and her reign, because there's quite a lot to that story, and I'm sure that I could do a mini-sode just on Vlaakith. So, if you want to hear about that, make sure to let me know and I can get writing. I also mentioned newborn Githyanki, which is a nice decent segue into our next topic, reproduction. Yes, it seems like it's a little out of left field, but trust me, I wouldn't specifically bring up reproduction if it weren't noteworthy. I've mentioned a couple of times when talking about the Githyanki and the Githzerai that they're a very isolationist people, and that they don't really seem to form parasocial relationships. And so it seems like it would be pretty hard for the Gith to find a mate that they can tolerate for long enough to procreate with. that is probably true. And thankfully, the Giths seem to evolve their way out of requiring physical intimacy in order to reproduce, further driving the nail in the introverted coffin. Instead, they asexually produce eggs despite being mammals with working reproductive organs, and they actually cannot reproduce by conventional means. As far as I can tell, every Gith is capable of reproduction on their own. Whether this was an intentional genetic experiment that came from the Mind Flayers playing God with the Gith while creating them, or whether they had it in them in their base form of their race that the Mind Flayers initially enslaved is currently unknown. Lae'zel in Baldur's Gate 3 states that laying eggs only happened after they escaped Illithid enslavement and moved to the astral plane, but I'm not really sure how that would make sense because that would mean that the Githzerai don't have that ability since they never inhabited the astral plane. So I'm going to take Lae'zel's words with a grain of salt. I'm going to assume that this happened in their time with the Mind Flayers, because I personally think it makes sense that this is something that the Mind Flayers would intentionally splice into their genetics. For a race that were bred to be slaves, you would want to be able to create as many of them as possible, and if you could make it that either gender could lay eggs on demand like a humanoid chicken, why wouldn't you want that? And not to get too philosophical here, but it makes sense from a psychological standpoint as well. For most races and most people, sex is a pleasurable act, and the want to reproduce is built into our physiology by tying pleasure to reproduction. I know this is really weird, but just bear with me for 1 second, I promise this is a good point, or at least I think it is. But if you were to take away the necessity for physical reproduction, you're also denying a certain amount of pleasure that's just granted upon most races. I'm having a hard time trying to convey this into words because I'm no philosopher, I'm just a guy on the internet who likes writing about fictional peoples. But the point I'm trying to make is that getting rid of that base layer of pleasure that is ingrained into our beings is something that would probably result in them being a more hardened, stoic race who's more focused on duty rather than finding joy in the simpler things that life has to offer. Not to say that they don't experience pleasure from the act itself, but they have no biological necessity to engage in it, and therefore probably don't engage much in the act at all. I mean, why would they? That would require forming a bond on some level, no matter how shallow and self-serving it might be, with another individual. And if we've learned anything about the Gith today, it's that they just don't have any interest in doing so. Then you have Gith like Lae'zel in Baldur's Gate who is hornier than a rabbit, but I'm not sure if that's because everyone is just written to have hots for the player character, or if maybe I'm just wrong about the Gith and they do like to do the nasty without forming bonds. I understand this is going to a really weird place, and so I'm just going to leave you to make your own conclusion with what I've presented. I do think it makes sense that the Mind Flayers would want this instilled in the Gith, but do with that information what you will. The point is, and I didn't have to say any of that, they lay eggs asexually, and we don't quite know why. And for the Githyanki, there's an entire subculture built around laying these eggs that wouldn't be there if they hadn't settled in the astral plane. There isn't much word about how the Githzerai are faring with their child rearing, but they don't face the same complications that the Githyanki do. So maybe they just lay when they feel like hatching a Githlet and go about their day like the frog chickens that they are. The Githyanki, however, have the unique problem of not aging while in the astral plane, if you remember. So trying to hatch eggs and raise young in a place where time basically doesn't exist poses some problems. And this is where we get the concept of a crèche. I told you I'd come back to it. We get some really great insight as to what a crèche looks like and how it operates in Act 1 of Baldur's Gate 3. In that case, the Githyanki inhabited Crèche, which used to be a temple for the worshippers of Lathander, who the Githyanki seemingly slaughtered and took over the place for their own. I'm sure that this wasn't always the case, however, and that they would have physically set up their own camps on occasion. But it does seem very Githyanki just to find somewhere that you want to lay eggs at, slaughter the ignorant inhabitants for daring to live in your crèche, and then making themselves at home. Because of that whole questline in Baldur's Gate, it's pretty hard to find any concrete history about crèches or anything about crèches that is not related to that quest, but I'm going to do my best to explain what they are with the very limited information that we have. So, crèche is actually a French word for a nursery, which is pretty on the nose. And why are the Githyanki using French words to name their nurseries after? Because D&D is a mishmash of whatever the writers decided they wanted to use at the time, and we don't really need more of a reason than that. D&D lore is a mess, and if you're going to complain about the Githyanki using French words, you're focusing on the wrong things. So that's what it is, a nursery, primarily at the very least. In the case of Crèche, It was an outpost for their current mission, but I think that was largely by happenstance. Because the eggs wouldn't be born in the astral plane, and the young Gith would never be able to grow to adulthood there either, a crèche was a semi-permanent, if not just permanent structure in which they would foster and raise their young until they were old enough to join a raid, where they would complete their rite of passage by killing an illithid and presenting its head to Vlaakith, and presumably proceed to go live in the astral realm. But while they were in a crèche, there would be all sorts of schools set up where they would learn about the teachings of Vlaakith and train in martial arts. And to make sure it wasn't just 1 or 2 children being raised at a time, the Githyanki were very careful about choosing when to bring eggs from the astral into the prime material plane to make sure that several eggs hatched at once. The ones who would look over the hatchery and rear their young would be known as a Varsh. We get some information about this topic from Baldur's Gate 3 from Lae'zel. I think that's probably where most of the information about crèches in general are bound to come from, since there aren't really many sources that talk about this process, except for a guide to the astral plane, which was released in 1996. And while a great resource in learning about all things Githyanki, it is quite outdated by this point. So from Lae'zel, we learned that Crèche Kalir held about 3 dozen eggs, but she says that she knew of some that held 100. I wonder if this is kind of an urban legend told by Vlaakith that there are hundreds of eggs all over the place as some sort of propaganda, but I also don't really see why they would have a reason to lie about it. The only issue I can see with crèches having hundreds of eggs is overpopulation. Because time doesn't really pass on the astral plane and Githyanki tend to live extremely long lives as a result of that, they don't lay eggs too often because they wouldn't know what to do with basically an unlimited number of Githyanki. Eventually, they would face overpopulation, and so their population was controlled by Vlaakith herself. We also glean from this conversation that the ones chosen by Vlaakith to lay eggs are called Shukiani. Vlaakith assigns them a crèche and tells them when, where, and how many eggs they are to bear. It seems like this process is pretty strict and rare, which led to a fairly low birth rate, keeping population stagnant and in check. And that's honestly pretty much all there is for the Gith. There are a couple of fringe topics I didn't really touch on because I didn't know where to put them, so I figure I'll just chuck them in here at the end. I mentioned the Githvyrik and the Gith Pirate tribes very briefly in the beginning of the episode, and I think it's worth talking about them for a second, even if we know basically next to nothing about them. So very quickly, the Pirates are basically a group of Gith who decided not to follow Zerthimon or Gith's followers into either Limbo or the Astral Plane respectively, but instead chose to stay in the Prime. Basically, they just became an extremely militarized group of pirates that occasionally exist in wild space. They raid, they plunder, they do what Gith do. And the Githvyrik are a group of Gith who didn't follow Zerthimon or Gith, but chose to basically renounce the Gith entirely. They refused to identify as either Githyanki or Githzerai, but chose to follow their own path outside of the typical militarized society of the Gith. I wish that we knew more about them because the entire idea sounds pretty neat. They see themselves as something greater, keeping that typical Gith arrogance, and I'd be interested to see them come up again. Maybe with the rising interest in Gith from Baldur's Gate 3, we'll see them return someday. Who knows? Then there was a third group that I haven't mentioned yet at all. We know that the Githyanki's hatred for the Githzerai was only second to their rivalry with the Illithids and vice versa. But there was a group that existed called the Sha'sal Khou, whose philosophy was to unite both sects under one roof, shedding the rivalry that existed between them. They wanted to get rid of the title Githyanki and Githzerai and instead unite under one banner and call themselves, simply, Gith. This sounds good and all, but their leader, Zecher, only wanted this so that he could guide the undivided military force of the Gith to continue the conquest that Gith had originally set out before the Civil War, which was destroy all Illithids. So basically it was the Githyanki goal, but he wanted the Githzerai there as well, so they had the full power of the Gith. So it was a great cause, all in all, to unite the Githyanki and the Githzerai, but it existed for all the wrong reasons, and the Githzerai would never go for that. They specifically left and became the Githzerai because of Gith's ideologies. But this group of people was pretty blasphemous to the Gith, and I'm sure that included Vlaakith, who personally unseated Gith herself, so they had to operate in secret somewhere on the Sword Coast. And with that out of the way, I think we're finally done here. I thought that this would be a very quick in and out, but it turns out that there's almost as much information about the Gith as there is about the Mind Flayers, which makes sense considering that they go hand in hand. I think it's worth mentioning here at the end of the episode that because both the Githyanki and the Githzerai are both constantly warring with the Illithids, the Gith are pretty much the only force across the multiverse that are keeping the Mind Flayers at bay and stopping the Illithid Empire from coming to fruition. I know I said that in the Mind Flayer episode as well, but I think it's worth reiterating that they are the single force that are keeping the Mind Flayers from enslaving everyone and everything across all planes. And I think that is extremely commendable and impressive. And I think it's even more impressive that they managed to do so after being enslaved as a race for God knows how long. They truly are my favorite species of frog. And that brings us to my favorite question, which is, what do you think? Did you know that there was a difference between the Githyanki and the Githzerai? Because, let me tell you, I didn't until researching for this episode. I'm not gonna lie, I thought that those were terms for the different genders, and I'm glad that I was educated in this regard. Or, what do you think about the fact that they lay eggs? Or the fact that I went into a weird tangent about Gith sexuality? I think it's all pretty fascinating, but it's also extremely confusing for a lot of reasons. I'm so sorry for that bit. It was terrible. I'll try never to do that again. You can find us online at Lord to Death on your favorite social media apps, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have any questions or suggestions for topics, please send me a message wherever you can find me at lordtodeath@gmail.com. If you're using the Spotify app, there's a Q&A function attached to the episode where you can submit any questions or topics. I would love to hear from you. And I usually don't say this, but please remember to rate us 5 stars wherever you're listening. If you're on YouTube, then leave a like and subscribe if you're not already. It really does help me out, and we're on the cusp of being able to monetize this podcast over there, so please share with anyone who you might think would be interested. That would mean a lot to me, and that's enough shilling for now. And remember, if you come across a frog that has gained sentience and starts talking about how it needs to start systematically eliminating all squids from the oceans, hear him out. Maybe he's onto something. And I'll lure you to death in the next one. See ya.